July 30th, 1943. 23,000 feet above Germany. The air up here is 40 degrees below zero. There is no sound you would recognize from the ground. Only the shriek of 4 engines, the hammer of 50 caliber guns somewhere forward, and a thin, cold whistle coming from a hole that wasn't there an hour ago. In the tail of a B-17 flying fortress named Tondelayo, Staff Sergeant Michael Arooth cannot feel his left leg. He looks down. Blood. Dark and spreading fast across his flight suit. A 20-millimeter cannon shell has just exploded close enough to tear metal into his leg and his side. His left gun is jammed. His oxygen line is cut. The interphone connecting him to the rest of his crew is dead. He is breathing recycled air that is getting thinner by the second. And somewhere behind him, closing fast, are more Messerschmitt 109s. By every rational measure, Michael Arooth should stop fighting. He does not stop. He reaches down with bleeding hands. He pulls at the jammed gun's mechanism. He gets it cycling again. The 4th Messerschmitt lines up from 6 o'clock. Arooth puts the gun on it. He fires. The fighter explodes. Now here is what will leave you speechless. That moment you just heard. A wounded man, alone in the back of a dying bomber, at the absolute edge of consciousness, still shooting. That is not the end of his story. That is the middle. By the time Michael Arooth was done, he would fly 14 missions over Germany and destroy at least 17 enemy aircraft. He was the greatest aerial gunner in the entire history of the United States Air Force. He never got a fighter pilot's fame. He never got a ticker tape parade. And when he died, in February of 1990, most Americans had never heard his name. This is the story of the man in the tail. If stories like this one, the ones history buried, are what you come here for, hit that subscribe button right now. Stories like Michael Arooth's are exactly why this channel exists. Do not miss what is coming next. To understand Michael Arooth, you have to understand what the 8th Air Force was facing in the summer of 1943. Because the story of one tail gunner does not exist without the story of an air campaign standing at the edge of total collapse. The idea had sounded reasonable enough on paper. American military planners, going back to the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field, Alabama, in the 1930s, had developed a doctrine called daylight precision bombing. The concept was elegant, almost beautiful in its logic. Send massive formations of B-17 flying fortresses over Germany in broad daylight. Hit specific industrial targets with pinpoint accuracy. Destroy the Nazi war machine from above. The bombers would defend themselves with sheer firepower. Each B-17 carried up to 1350 caliber machine guns. The Luftwaffe would bleed itself dry trying to stop them. It did not work that way. By the summer of 1943, the 8th Air Force was learning the truth about high-altitude bombing over Europe in the hardest school that exists. The school where the lessons are written in fire and falling aircraft. German fighters had adapted with terrifying speed. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 came screaming head-on at 400 miles per hour in firing passes that lasted less than 2 seconds. They attacked from below, from above, in coordinated waves that broke off and came back again and again. They waited for the American escort fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolts, to hit the limit of their fuel range and turn for home. And the moment those escorts peeled away, the Luftwaffe swarmed. The numbers were brutal. A navigator in one bomb group, a former insurance actuary by profession, sat down one evening and ran the mathematics for his pilot. He looked at the mission loss rates, the number of missions required for a completed tour, the probability of surviving each individual flight. Then he put down his pencil and said, matter-of-factly, that there just was not any way, mathematically, they were going to live through it. He was not being dramatic. He was being accurate. In late 1943, the average life expectancy of an 8th Air Force B-17 was 11 missions. The required tour of duty was 25. Think about what that means. The aircraft you were flying had, statistically, less than a 50% chance of surviving half the missions you needed to go home. The crews that flew those missions knew this. They could see it every time they looked out the window at the formation around them. They watched American bombers, not enemy bombers, American ones, take direct hits and come apart in midair. Some went down slowly, trailing smoke and fire. Some disappeared in an instant of orange light. Some of the men who were not killed outright came back in such pieces that the ground crews used hoses to clean the turrets. Elmer Bendener, the navigator aboard the B-17 Tondelayo, wrote about it years later with the brutal honesty that only a survivor can produce. He had seen dead men washed out of their turrets with a hose. And yet he also described something more complicated, something that made him uncomfortable to admit even decades later. He was, he wrote, undeniably alive in battle. Not the war of boredom and vermin they had read about in their fathers' accounts of the First World War. A frenzy in which he heaved and sweated and could not stop, because shamefully his guts loved what his head hated. That tension, that terrible, honest tension between fear and the electric aliveness of combat. It lived in every man who flew those missions, but it lived differently in Michael Arooth than it did in almost anyone else. Now picture the tail gunner's position on a B-17. Picture it precisely. You reach it by crawling through the full length of the aircraft, past the radio compartment, past the ball turret gunner curled inside his plexiglass sphere below the fuselage, past the waist gunners standing at open windows in air cold enough to freeze exposed skin solid in minutes. At the very back, beyond a narrow crawl space, is a small compartment barely large enough for one man. You kneel inside it. The plexiglass bubble around you gives you a wide, clear view directly behind the aircraft. 2 Browning M250 caliber machine guns are mounted at your sides. You control them with your hands and the weight of your body. You have roughly 2,500 rounds. You wear a heated flight suit, but the cold still gets in. Your oxygen runs through a line from the aircraft system. Your only link to the rest of the crew is an interphone headset. And behind you, there is nothing. Just open sky and whatever is coming out of it. The Luftwaffe knew exactly where that tail gun was. They knew its weaknesses, the angles it could not cover, the zones where its traverse could not reach. They probed those edges on every pass, and they knew that killing the tail gun early gave the rest of their formation more freedom to maneuver against the bombers. So they targeted it first. There is a certain type of man who volunteers for that seat knowing all of this. Combat veterans and historians who interviewed aerial gunners noted common characteristics: fast hands, exceptional eyes, and a psychological temperament that did not crumble under helplessness. In the tail position, you controlled nothing about the larger situation. You could not choose where the pilot flew. You could not control how many fighters came. All you controlled was whether your guns were working and whether you hit what you aimed at. Either that kind of helplessness drove a man toward breakdown, or it focused him down into something pure and clear and almost cold. Michael Louis Arooth was born in 1919. He joined the United States Army Air Forces. He trained as a gunner. He was assigned to the 527th Bomb Squadron of the 379th Bombardment Group based at Kimbolton, England. And the men who flew with him knew very quickly that he was different. Elmer Bendener, whose memoir The Fall of Fortresses is one of the finest first-hand accounts of the entire air war, describes a detail that tells you everything you need to know about how Michael Arooth was regarded. The commanding colonel of the bomb group had a habit. When he was personally flying a particularly dangerous mission, he commandeered the best gunners from across the squadron for his own aircraft. The colonel of a bomb group has access to every gunner under his command. He can choose anyone. When he flew, he chose Arooth in the tail, the best gunner in the 379th Bombardment Group, a unit that would ultimately fly more combat sorties and drop more bombs than any other group in the entire 8th Air Force. 10,492 sorties, 26,459 tons of bombs. Out of every gunner in that group, the colonel wanted Michael Arooth behind him when it mattered. The aircraft that would carry his legend into the sky already had a name painted on her nose. B-17 Flying Fortress, serial number 42-29896, 527th Bomb Squadron, 379th Bomb Group. Her name was Tondelayo. By July of 1943, the 379th had been bleeding for 2 months. Their first 2 missions cost 9 bombers. They had learned, mission by mission, what it meant to fly without escort into the German heartland. And on the morning of July 30th, 1943, they went back. The target was Kassel, the Nazi aero engine manufacturing shops in central Germany. These were not peripheral facilities. Kassel's factories were building the actual engines powering the same Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that were tearing the 8th Air Force apart. 186 B-17s lifted off from bases across the English Midlands, escorted by 123 P-47 Thunderbolts. It was the best escort the 8th could provide that summer, and it still was not enough. The P-47s would protect the formation partway in and partway out. The moment they reached their fuel limit and turned for home, the Luftwaffe would be waiting. Tondelayo climbed into formation. Arooth settled into the tail position. The English coast fell away beneath them. Bendener described the mission with the clarity of a man who survived something that should have killed him. Tondelayo was hit almost continuously by fighters and by anti-aircraft flak from below. Pilot Bone Fawkes threw the big bomber through what Bendener called a crazy choreography, climbing and diving and corkscrewing in patterns designed to unsettle the fighters pressing in from all sides. In the tail, Arooth was already firing. German fighters came in waves, hedge-hopping from airfield to airfield along the bomber's flight path to refuel and return. He shot down one, then another, then a third. Then the cannon shell found him. A 20mm Mauser round from a German fighter detonated close enough to tear metal through his leg and side. His left gun jammed, damaged in the same burst. His oxygen supply line was severed. The interphone went dead. At 23,000 feet, without oxygen, the physiological clock starts immediately. Hypoxia does not feel like suffocation. It feels like warmth, comfort, a gentle drift toward unconsciousness. Men have died in tail positions because they did not realize they were dying until they were already gone. Arooth realized it. He turned from the guns long enough to reach for his emergency oxygen supply. With a shattered leg and bleeding wounds, he could not get to it. That door was closed. So he turned back to the guns. What happened next is recorded in the official citation for the Distinguished Service Cross, a document signed in the name of the President of the United States. The citation reads that without oxygen, and with his leg shattered and bleeding, Sergeant Arooth displayed extraordinary heroism, and with complete disregard for his personal safety, remained at his post, and defended his airplane and crew with his one good gun. When that gun jammed, he skillfully repaired the malfunction, resumed firing, and destroyed his 4th airplane. 4 German aircraft destroyed. Wounded, no oxygen, 2 guns down. 1 gun repaired by hand under fire. He kept fighting. Now here is where I need you to stop for a moment, because there is something happening in that tail position on July 30th, 1943, that goes beyond military heroism in the way the word is commonly used. This is not a man charging a machine gun nest in a moment of adrenaline. This is a man who, in cold blood, with a shattered leg and no oxygen, reached into a broken weapon with his bare hands, fixed it, and went back to work. That requires a different kind of will, a slower, quieter, more deliberate kind of courage that is, in many ways, more difficult to sustain than the explosive courage of a sudden charge. Historians still debate whether Michael Arooth's total of 17 credited kills over 14 missions is precisely accurate. Roger Freeman's authoritative history, The Mighty Eighth, which is the definitive record of the 8th Air Force, officially credits Arooth with 9 confirmed kills. The National Museum of the Mighty 8th Air Force and the Hall of Valor Military Awards database cite 17. Some accounts estimate the actual total exceeded 20. The truth almost certainly sits within that range. And the reason there is a debate at all is not because the records are disputed, but because the United States Army Air Forces had a deliberate policy that prevented individual gunners from receiving official credit for their kills. Think about that. A fighter pilot who shot down 5 enemy aircraft became an officially recognized ace. His name went in the papers. His photograph was taken. He received formal commendation. The threshold was fixed and public and celebrated. 5 kills, and you were somebody that history would remember. Bomber gunners were excluded from that system entirely. During the air war over Europe, the gunners aboard American heavy bombers collectively destroyed 6,259 enemy aircraft, with another 1,836 probables and more than 3,000 damaged. They were fighting the same enemy, in many cases under greater personal risk than fighter pilots, from positions with less mobility, less protection, and far less chance of escape if the aircraft went down. And the formal system that would have made them famous simply did not apply to them. The Army Air Forces had a rationale. When multiple guns from multiple aircraft were all firing at the same enemy fighter, determining exactly whose rounds brought it down was genuinely difficult. The policy also reflected a philosophy about unit cohesion, the idea that gunners should think of themselves as part of a team rather than as individual aces accumulating a personal score. The result was that Michael Arooth flew 14 missions through the bloodiest air campaign in American history, shot down somewhere between 9 and 20-plus German aircraft, and went home without a number attached to his name that history could agree on. While newspapers ran photographs of fighter pilots and the public learned their names and their kill counts, the men in the bombers' turrets remained largely anonymous. They fought harder in many ways. They died in greater proportions, and history forgot them faster. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it before you answer in the comments. Michael Arooth flew his 4th kill with a shattered leg, no oxygen, and a gun he fixed by hand. Every man in that tail position knew the statistics. They knew what the odds were. They knew what happened to men who were in that position when a fighter got through. If you were sitting in that tail gunner's seat, bleeding, knowing you were most likely going to lose consciousness within the next few minutes, would you have gone back to the gun? Drop your honest answer in the comments right now, because I genuinely want to know, and your answer says something about you that is worth knowing about yourself. But here is what the July 30th mission still had waiting, something that nobody aboard Tondelayo knew about until the aircraft landed. When the ground crew began their post-mission inspection at Kimballton, they found something inside the fuel tanks that stopped them cold. 11 20mm cannon shells were lodged inside the fuel tanks. 11 unexploded shells. Each one alone, if it had detonated on impact, would have ignited the fuel and turned Tondelayo into a fireball. 11 shells. 11 times the aircraft should have exploded. 11 times every man aboard should have died. 11 times something did not go off. The shells were pulled and sent to the armorers. What the armorers found when they opened them was something that the crew, even years later, struggled to find adequate language for. The shells were empty. No explosive charge. All of them. Empty. Clean, in Bendener's words, as a whistle and as harmless as a handful of dirt. All of them except one. One shell was not quite empty. Inside it, rolled with extraordinary care, was a small piece of paper, written in Czech. Intelligence officers at Kimballton eventually found a man on the base who could read it. And what that message said, translated into English, was 5 words. This is all we can do for you now. Somewhere in a Nazi munitions factory, a prisoner working under forced labor, someone from Czechoslovakia or Poland or anywhere in the vast network of human beings the Nazi regime had put to work building the machinery of its war, had done this. They had taken live 20mm cannon shells, emptied the explosive charge out of them, sealed them back up so they passed inspection, loaded them into the production line, and sent them out, knowing that if it worked, men they would never meet would live who would otherwise die, knowing that if they were caught, they themselves would die, knowing that they might never know if their act of defiance had made any difference at all. They did it anyway. The identity of whoever wrote that note has never been established. They remain completely anonymous, one of the small, unreachable mysteries of the war. Historians have noted that Bendener's original account in The Fall of Fortresses does not include a secondary line about Jewish slave labor that appears in some later retellings. The core facts, as Bendener recorded them from his own direct experience, are 11 empty shells and 1 note in Czech. Those facts are confirmed. The exact identity of who sent them and what happened to that person afterward is lost. What is not lost is what it meant to the crew of Tondelayo. They went to sleep that night knowing that an anonymous human being, living under conditions that most of us cannot fully imagine, had risked everything they had to give, which was everything, to save the lives of 10 American strangers they had never seen. Arooth went back into the air. That is the part of this story that needs to be felt before it can be understood. He recovered from the July 30th wounds. He returned to the 527th Bomb Squadron. He strapped back into the tail of another B-17 and flew again, and again. Across the summer and into the fall of 1943, mission by mission, he kept adding to what the men who served alongside him would later describe as the greatest individual kill record of any aerial gunner in the history of the Air Force. He was flying during the period of maximum danger. The first Schweinfurt raid, on August 17, 1943, sent 376 bombers against 2 critical targets, the Messerschmitt aircraft factories at Regensburg and the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. 60 American bombers were lost. The 379th Bomb Group, remarkably, lost none that day. They flew through everything and brought their aircraft home. But October 14th, 1943 was something else entirely. That day is called Black Thursday, and it earned the name. The 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17s back to Schweinfurt to finish what August had started. The P-47 escort fighters that day were inexplicably operating without drop tanks, which reduced their range even further than normal. They could protect the formation for the first 200 miles. Then they wagged their wings at the bombers in the traditional farewell gesture of the air war, and they turned for home. The moment they left, the Luftwaffe hit the formation with everything it had. German fighters, Bf-109s and FW-190s, and twin-engine Bf-110s launching rockets from outside defensive gun range, attacked in coordinated waves throughout the entire remainder of the mission. The 305th Bomb Group lost 13 of its 15 aircraft. The 306th lost 12. By the time the day was over, 60 American bombers had been shot down. More than 600 American airmen were dead, wounded, or captured. Nearly 20% of the entire attacking force gone in a single day. The 379th Bomb Group lost 6 aircraft. The air campaign against Germany, the doctrine that bombers could fight their way through unescorted, was broken. The 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration raids for 5 months. Arooth flew through all of it. 14 missions across the bloodiest summer and fall in 8th Air Force history. At least 17 enemy aircraft destroyed, possibly more than 20. Carrying the full weight of the most dangerous position in the aircraft, in the most dangerous air campaign in American history, in the most dangerous period of that campaign. And then came September 6, 1943. Stuttgart. The target was Stuttgart, 500 miles inside Germany. Navigator Elmer Bendener calculated the math of that mission with precision. A heavily loaded B-17, flying at moderate altitude in formation, zigging and zagging in evasive action, would make the round trip but land with fuel tanks nearly empty. No margin, none at all. Tondelayo made it to the target. She made it through the bomb run. She turned for home, and on the return flight, the Luftwaffe came back at her. Arooth fought through that engagement and shot down more German aircraft. Accounts of this specific mission credit him with 3 kills in the running total of his overall combat record. But Tondelayo had taken catastrophic punishment. German 20mm fire had perforated the fuselage, damaged critical systems, torn through hydraulics. The aircraft was dying in the air. Pilot Bone Fox made the only decision left to him. He stretched every last drop of fuel, trying to reach England. The aircraft ran out of sky before she ran out of water. Somewhere over the English Channel, Fox gave the order to ditch. Ditching a B-17 in the English Channel is not a controlled landing. It is a controlled crash into water at speed. The nose digs in on impact. The aircraft pitches forward with tremendous force. Survival rates for B-17 channel ditchings varied dramatically depending on the season, the condition of the aircraft, and luck. The Fox crew ditched in summer, which gave them their best chance. Every man aboard survived. Arooth paid a price. In the violence of the ditching, he suffered a severe head injury, a deep gash that put him in medical care for weeks. A photograph taken at Kimballton on September 7, 1943, the morning after the crew was rescued and returned to base, shows them gathered together in borrowed British clothing, looking hollowed out in the way that people look when something that should have killed them did not. At the far right of the photograph, seated, with his head heavily bandaged, is Michael Arooth. Tondelayo settled into the English Channel and sank. She is still there. No one knows exactly where. After recovering from his head wound, Arooth flew 3 more missions with the 527th. Then the complications from that head injury became too severe. The Army Air Forces grounded him. Not for cowardice, not for breakdown, but because his body was simply no longer safe to send back into the sky. He had given everything the position asked for, and then everything beyond that. 14 missions, at least 17 enemy aircraft destroyed, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 air medals with oak leaf clusters, the Purple Heart, the record of the greatest aerial gunner in the history of the United States Air Force. And now here's the part of this story that I need you to sit with, because it is where the story stops being about war and starts being about something more uncomfortable. Michael Arooth came home. He served in the United States Armed Forces until 1962, nearly 20 years after the war ended. And for most of those decades, and for most of the decades since, most Americans had no idea who he was. Why? The answer is not complicated. It is just painful. Bomber gunners as a class of combatant were systematically left out of the framework of individual recognition that the military built for fighter pilots. An American fighter pilot who shot down 5 enemy aircraft became an officially designated ace. That designation came with newspapers, photographs, commendations, public ceremonies, and a permanent place in the national narrative of the air war. 5 kills, and history knew your name. Gunners were not allowed into that system. The 305 enlisted air gunners in World War II who were credited with 5 or more aerial victories received no official ace designation. None. They fought the same enemy. They flew into the same airspace. They died at comparable rates. The system that would have made them famous did not apply to them, and the Army never changed that policy. Some gunners received individual honors. Arooth's Distinguished Service Cross is real recognition, and it represents a genuine acknowledgement of his courage on July 30th, 1943. But the DSC citation describes one mission, one act of heroism. It does not describe 14 missions and 17 aircraft. The larger kill count was unofficial, pieced together by the men who flew alongside him, and by historians who worked backward through mission records and crew accounts after the war. And because there was no official individual credit system for gunner kills, there is no clean number for history to hold on to. Roger Freeman's authoritative history credits 9 confirmed kills. The National Museum of the Mighty 8th Air Force says 17. Some accounts say more than 20. The truth is in that range somewhere, and the uncertainty itself is part of the problem. When history has nothing precise to grasp, the story slides away. Historians still debate this today. It is worth labeling it as such. There is genuine academic disagreement not only about Arooth's personal total, but about whether the strategic bombing campaign itself achieved what its architects claimed. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, managed to maintain and even increase German war production through much of 1943 and 1944, adapting to the bombing faster than Allied planners expected. Arthur Harris, who commanded RAF Bomber Command, had questioned the specific value of the Schweinfurt ball-bearing targets even during the war. Post-war analysis showed that Germany had larger reserves of ball bearings than Allied intelligence estimated, and that the cascading industrial collapse the planners predicted did not materialize as quickly or as completely as hoped. But whatever the historians ultimately conclude about the strategic mathematics of the bombing campaign, there is one thing that is not in debate. The men who flew those missions did something that was, by any honest accounting, extraordinary. They flew into conditions that should have broken them, with incomplete equipment, inadequate escort, and statistics that said they would not survive, and they kept going back because the man in the next turret was depending on them. Michael Arooth did that better than anyone. If this story is changing the way you understand what the air war over Europe really was, what it actually cost, and what it actually required of the men who fought it, hit that like button right now. It tells me that this kind of story matters to you, and it helps other people find these forgotten names. In 1958, 15 years after Arooth had been grounded from combat, the United States government held a ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery to enter the unknown soldier of World War II. The remains were selected from cemeteries across Europe, Africa, Hawaii, and the Philippines to represent the hundreds of thousands of Americans who had died in that war and had no grave of their own. President Eisenhower attended. The nation watched. Michael Arooth was chosen as a pallbearer. Think about what that selection meant. Out of 16 million Americans who served in World War II, out of every veteran of the air war over Europe, out of every man who had ever sat in a bomber's turret, the United States Army looked at the record and chose Michael Arooth to carry the unknown soldier to his rest. The greatest aerial gunner in the history of the Air Force. The man that his commanding colonel always wanted in the tail when everything was on the line. The man who fixed a jammed gun with a shattered leg and no oxygen and killed his fourth aircraft of the day. They chose him. And most of the country watching that ceremony on May 30th, 1958, had no idea who he was. He walked away from Arlington that day, having performed one final act of service for the men of the air war. For the ones who came home, and especially for the ones who did not. Michael Louis Arooth died on February 15, 1990, in St. Augustine, Florida. He was 70 years old. He is interred at the National Memorial Cemetery in Phoenix, Arizona. A tribute to him was read into the congressional record by Massachusetts Senator Richard Neal. It was one of the very few formal moments when the government acknowledged on the public record what this man had been and what he had done. The Tondelayo is on the floor of the English Channel. No one knows the exact coordinates. There is no marker above that water, no monument, no memorial flag. Just the cold Atlantic over a B-17 that carried her crew through some of the worst combat in the history of aviation and gave everything she had. The crew she carried all survived the war. Pilot Bone Fox, Navigator Elmer Bendener, co-pilot Charles Malden, Bombardier Robert Haney, all of them. Remarkably, every man on the Fox crew who was alive when the Stuttgart mission began came home. The last survivor, co-pilot Charles Malden, died in 2009 at 87 years old. Bendener wrote his memoir, The Fall of Fortresses, in 1980. It remains one of the most honest and morally serious accounts of the air war ever published. In it, the Czech note, those 5 words, "This is all we can do for you now," becomes something larger than the moment it describes. It becomes a statement about everyone in that war who fought from the shadows, without weapons, without recognition, without any certainty that their small acts of defiance were reaching anyone at all. The unknown prisoner emptied 11 shells and rolled a piece of paper inside one of them and sent it out into the dark and hoped. It worked. And here is the final thing I want to leave you with. There is a moment on July 30th, 1943, that happened in complete isolation. No witness except Arooth himself and whatever German pilots were close enough to see. A wounded man, alone in the back of a dying bomber, his oxygen gone and his leg torn open, reached for a broken gun and fixed it with his bare hands. Nobody told him to. The interphone was dead. Nobody could see him. Nobody would have blamed him if he had stopped. The mission was effectively over for him. Any reasonable calculation of his own survival said stop. He did not stop. He picked up the gun and put another round through another Messerschmitt. That act, that private, unwitnessed, completely voluntary act of will, is the Distinguished Service Cross. It is the 9 or 17 or 20-plus aircraft destroyed. It is the pallbearer's walk at Arlington in 1958. It is the tribute entered into the congressional record by a senator from Massachusetts. It is everything that defines Michael L. Arooth. Not the headlines he never got. Not the fame that went to the fighter pilots. Not the kill count that history could never quite agree on. What defines him is that moment in the tail of the Tondelayo when he made a choice that nobody required him to make. He chose his crew over his pain. He chose the mission over the bleeding. He chose to stay. That choice, that single, private, unremarkable seeming, and yet almost impossibly difficult choice. That is what winning the air war over Europe actually looked like from inside the aircraft. Not from the briefing rooms, not from the headlines, from the tail. 14 missions, at least 17 kills, one of the most decorated enlisted airmen in the history of the 8th Air Force, the greatest gunner who ever sat in a B-17. Most people have never heard his name. Now, you have. If you want to know more of these stories, the ones that history passed over, the men who did the most and got the least credit for it, subscribe right now. And leave me one name in the comments, one forgotten soldier, airman, or sailor from any war whose story you think deserves to be told. If I can research it, I will make it. Every comment gets read. Every name matters. Michael Louis Arooth, 527th Bomb Squadron, 379th Bombardment Group, 8th Air Force, the man in the tail. Remember his name.